How do you test 1, 2? How do you test 1, 2? Alrighty. Welcome everybody. This is Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and this is the Game Master Soapbox. We're on the NycosRPG channel, and our sponsor is Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California. If you appreciate any form of card game, board game, miniatures game, etc., Board Game Paradise is the place to be in Redlands, California. I operate games there on Mondays and Tuesdays, 6 p.m. until 10. Had a great session tonight, by the way. It was a blast, and we do it every Monday and Tuesday from 6 to 10. So if you are in the Southern California region and want to stop by, the store is on State Street in Redlands, California. You can find more information by going to boardgameparadise.com, or they're also on Facebook under Board Game Paradise. So, alrighty, as usual, I have my topics listed up here. We're going to be talking about control surfaces being conditions and modifiers in the exercise of a role-play game. We are going to talk about establishing a base of operations for an adventure groups and how to establish that. We're also going to talk about the essence of magic in RPGs and if they are or are not the same effect as superheroics in superhero games. We're also going to talk about language, linguistics, and lore. The meat and potatoes of role-play games is usually the lore or the story behind the game, and the languages and the written forms of that, the linguistics of the languages, are sometimes core to the meaning and the essence of the messages that occur in-game. Today's rant is going to be on player criticism and correction, and that's of players picking on players or calling out players and such. It's near and dear to my heart and frustrating as all get out. And then we're going to continue to beat the drum for the NycosRPG Twitch Open Experiment, which is Saturdays at 10 a.m. We'll get a little bit more information about that and set up the future of those events going forward. As with each of these session episodic parts, I take a minute or so to clear the palate before I start into the next one. So as we hit each of the subjects, there'll be a slight pause. Okay, control surfaces. The reason why I'm calling this section on conditions and modifiers control surfaces is this. In one of my many careers, I was an air traffic controller at Norton Air Force Base. And when you become an air traffic controller, you have to learn some of the basics of flight. And one of those is that an aircraft's surface must have means of adjusting the airflow or the airfoil around the aircraft to modify its trajectory, its speed, its track over the ground, and so on. These surfaces that are moving surfaces or adjustable surfaces are considered to be the control surfaces. So you might have heard such terms as aileron or rudder. These terms are referring to surfaces that they can have their attitude adjusted up or down, their direction modified left or right, and even the attitude of the aircraft in reference to the ground can be modified by the use of these control surfaces. The reason why there are control surfaces in flight is to guide and direct the path and trajectory and ultimately the landing capabilities of the aircraft. So in the same fashion, control surfaces have to be put into place in a role-play game to monitor things like the tempo of the game. We talked a little bit about pacing yesterday, and the idea of how do you speed up or slow down the tempo of a session. How do you guide the players towards or away from marshal conflict? How do you take control of or guide the decision-making process of the group? So the easiest way is to create the equivalent of control surfaces. Now, that seems kind of odd because in a story, usually you think of the story as not being a mobile thing, but the reality is that the story can certainly shift and alter by the emphasis put on the location, the intensity of the interactions with NPCs and such like. So, conditions and modifiers are the means of doing that. Now, in traditional roleplay games such as Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, the usual method for doing so is to adjust the die roll that is required by the player to succeed or fail. And those success-failure modifiers are, generally speaking, a positive number that increases the likelihood of your success. And only rarely are there negative values that actually reduce the targeting effectiveness of the character. So it becomes problematic when everything is a plus. There's the argument can be made, I should say, that in roleplay games, it's perfectly fine for your defensive value to be a negative, especially since you're taking it into account in comparison with the modifiers and the base number, which would all be positives for the character. Of course, if you have a campaign and it has 10 story points and you have dedicated a certain number of them to positive modifiers, it's kind of awkward to put one in that has a negative modifier. So that's why when you look at them, they tend to be a bland numeric value, and in general, combat tends to become somewhat of a slog as you do the calculation, including the modifier for the first attack, and then every attack thereafter has that same modifier, so it's no longer a challenge or a wonder. You kind of have an idea what you need to roll to be able to succeed in the first place. So how do you establish your control surfaces? Well, first of all, you realize where they could be placed. One of the easiest is on mobility. And that literally would be the control surface, wouldn't it? If the ground upon which you are walking becomes slick and it becomes difficult to keep your balance, that is definitely one way to control the physical action. Perhaps it could be the wind, could be a modifier, if you're especially you're talking about ranged attacks. The moisture, humidity in the air can affect how well you can hold on to your weapon's handle or the bow that you're using to launch the arrows downstream. All of these could be control surfaces, and generally speaking, the easiest way is to set them at a numeric value, and then as they either are needed or not, they are applied. So if you are dealing with the conflict of individuals that are climbing upon the top of a roof of a house, then certainly the footing would be important. You know, if the tile roof is slick or the tiles are loose, these things might modify the condition of the fight and therefore adjust the winners, losers, and how long the fight takes. Control surfaces also tend to allow you to make it so that the session will glide. It'll move past the rough parts of a dialogue or whatever, so that you can just simply say, well, that modifier applies for this length of time. Examples within the game of such things would be being restrained, or having the ability to attack reduced, such as by being slowed or whatever. These control surfaces generally apply only for a short period of time, and in many cases are eliminated from possibility after the first trigger of them. So For NycosRPG, the control surfaces are actually in the hands of the players, and arguably the monstrous side if the die rolls go our way. But generally speaking, the control surfaces are those conditions placed on a character after a success on your part and a failure on the villain's part. So whenever those things occur, then the players get to exert the equivalent of a condition on the game situation. In tonight's game, for example, there was a situation where the villain was being particularly annoying by simply adding to the potential skills list that a player can interact with, and it just ultimately is a deficit, and it keeps the game from running out of gas or running out of kilter, and keeps it on the established pathways. Control surfaces can be static. In other words, they can be so that when the player moves off of a location, that condition no longer applies. Like the flooring might be icy, or the ground might be wet, and therefore there's a chance of slippage and such. That's a example of a condition and what the outcome might be. The control surfaces can be constant. In other words, if you have a weapon that is always arguing with you as you're trying to do your various actions, then the conversational tone of the character the equipment or whatever that is talking back needs to be taken into account, and that will modify the session and the episode in particular as little or as much as you as a storyteller want. All in all, the control surfaces are the easiest way to adjust and modify without having to argue or defend your position on why things changed in game. If you provided a sensible reason for a control surface, then there's no room for invalidating it in the eyes of the other players. So now let's talk about establishing a base of operations. There is a lot of negative connotation put on player characters who have no established home base. They are generally collectively called murder hobos because the general motif of most RPGs is go to the villain's cavern, kick down the door, and kill them. And that process, while it feeds a part of human psyche because we like the idea of finishing things, and therefore if the problem is a goblin, then you go and dispatch the goblin. That takes care of the problem. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't let the players in character feel any sense of ownership of their communities. If instead you create a base of operations within game, you not only create opportunities for recurring player characters and even story characters to be involved with the players above and beyond the actual campaign to which they are targeted, but it also gives the players a sense of ownership of the locale, and the players can therefore get involved in the local communication, local politics, local dramas, and that opens up a whole avenue for roleplay games that you may not have considered. So it may be paramount in most cases to establish a base of operations. Now, why would a base of operations be preferable to a random location? Well, a centralized base of operations means if the players literally don't have anything that they can run into doing, they can always check into the lore of the source and see if there's a way to play the game with only myself advising. So the establishing a base becomes a means for enhancing the longevity and continuity of a group. This not only gives them a place that they can use as a refuge, but it also might be a place where they are staging the operations equipment. You may have determined that there is a particular monster that they wish to eliminate, but they don't have the resource or the number of bodies at the specific game event to take on that villain. By establishing a base of operations, you might pick up additional non-player characters from that area that are familiar with what the characters generally try to do, and therefore becomes, for the players, a resource of their own. So, okay. Pardon me. So, is magic your thing? Are you fascinated with the mystical and the magical and want to have that included in your roleplay games? Well, this is a sticky wicket, isn't it? Because on the one hand, magic is a mystery and a wonder, and quite fun to sit around and debate until the cows come home with how the magic works. If you cast a tongues spell, is it giving you the ability to hear the opponent in the language that they have to write for, or is it defending the non-player character to the point of making it a ongoing effect? Well, the essence of magic is, in the micro scale, kind of a wish fulfillment. The very idea of magic working is itself a fanciful position, and while there are arguably thousands of magicians in the world, I would hazard a guess that there's very little true magic stemming from that practice. So what is the essence of magic, and how do we get it into our games? Well, as I suggest here, the concept of superheroes is a ubiquitous one nowadays. There are all the Marvel heroes and the Marvel movies. There are the DC comic books and the DC series. And of course, then there's all these solos that are banking on the success of the others to create and build their own version. So, if we're going to look at the concept of magic, I lost my train of thought. If we are talking about magic in a game, that magic is a wish fulfilled. It is a device that allows for something special to happen in the game that does not follow the laws of physics. And in effect, that is the same as the superhero genre, because in the superhero genre, the things that the players are able to do are not among the concepts of what a common person would do. And in the same fashion, those effects, those superhero effects or those magic effects, are either Deus Ex Machina, or they are flat out genie out of a bottle kind of magic. And so the question is, how realistic do you want your game to be in terms of magic? I mean, there truly is sleight of hand where somebody's hands are moving faster than their eyes. There's also misdirection where the person does something that gives the visual impression that magic has occurred, but there may not be anything, of course, magical about it. So the question becomes, what are you doing within your game? Well, then the game of Nykos uses the concept of touch points. In other words, there are elemental and existential points in space and time that the players can tap into to establish and affect a magical condition. And by having this arcane lore message, this rule for how magic works, gives it an anchor for players to express those forms and essences in a way that doesn't interfere with the story and allows the players to perhaps, again, fulfill wishes or do things that they've always wanted to do in an RPG that they can't do otherwise. For Nykos, it is the rule of Spectaculatin, and that's the ratchet effect. You have to have magic activate, and when you do, the activation determines the type of magical effect that can be accomplished. So, in the case of Nykos, you've got the pantheon, if you will, of the veils, in which case the 9 philosophies of Nykos, actually the 10 philosophies of Nykos, can be accepted and enhanced and fed back as the effect's source. Whereas maybe instead you have another wizard or a cleric who's advocating for the Order of Phalan, which refers to elemental magic. Well, you can have any form of essence that you want, and the point is that the mechanism needs to make a coherent sense for that player role. Since NycosRPG doesn't have character classes, it's less cut and dried as it is in other RPGs, because literally anybody can conceive of and enact a magical effect in NycosRPG. You simply have to have the will and a decision on how it is accomplished. And that may feel like a little bit of hand waving, but the reality is that magic itself is so personal that it's difficult to set a framework whereby the rules in magic and the rules in any function of the game demands there to be some kind of limits or parameters. And the essence of magic in Nykos is utilizing the scale, which is called Spectaculatin. That's the 5 forms of magic on Nykos. There are specks of magic. They don't take but a little portion of their source. There's the tick of magic, which means that you're doing a more grave spell, or it's got a deeper tie into the character's position in the game. There's the tick, the cowl. The cowl is the most practical, larger volume, and equates about to the size of a graveling. It's basically what you could hold in the 2 palms of your hand. Then there's the lot, and the lot is metaphorically and literally a lot. In other words, the amount that you have to use is not insignificant, and you have to have rationally thought of how the players could have that material available for use. And then finally you've got ton, which is a ton, 2,000 pounds. It's an arbitrary device that I came up with. So the players must determine which of the categories they're facing and decide how they're going to counteract it rationally with the skills that they have. So the final element of the essence of magic has to be the intent. And if you are activating a spell effect with the intent of causing bodily harm to a target, then the essence of magic has to also be focused towards that. And there are certain colors that simply wouldn't be, but that's a topic for another time. Just be aware that the essence of magic in the NycosRPG system is a understanding that the players are defining for themselves what their restrictions are, and then the playthrough of the story in game is the establishment of the scene type and the justification of how the players could be involved with that effect being in place. All right. Language, linguistics, and lore. And this was going to be a short one. The fundamental concept is that I, as a game master, don't know more than one language. I have studied a little bit of German. I live in Southern California, so I've heard a smattering of Spanish. But the element that's really important is that when we are the storyteller and we are describing the conditions of a game, we have to be speaking in a language that the players understand. I mean, if I decided I wanted to try to make my campaign all about the rants, so to speak, then the exact spelling of each of the rants would be present and measurable, and then you would be able to determine what's going on by the language that's being spoken. But since language, in my case, is always going to be English, the concept of transferring that lore dump to another source becomes A, silly, and B, problematic, because a player who finds a book isn't going to wait around till he finds somebody that also speaks the language of the foreign book. He's going to take it home and he's going to try to cross-analyze it, and figure it out on his own. When a player shows a fascination for language, more than likely they're looking for something that allows them to communicate with either players or a non-player character in a way that allows them to secure information for themselves. And while it's important to realize that store owners can actually become a part, I say store owners? I'm doing it again. I don't know why I drift like this, but if you are operating in a specific language and you're trying to convey that difference to another player, then the idea of having multiple languages becomes something important. And the number of skills that people put into the various languages they want to take is directly a relationship to how many provided languages there are involved. If everybody is speaking common, why would you ever have to develop a skill in speaking French, for example? And I'm not saying that French isn't common, so don't write me any comments about that part. The essence is that language I perceive of as being the spoken form, and therefore you can learn to speak a language. But linguistics is a study of the written word, and therefore if you are going to be reading something that was written in a foreign language, you would need the linguistics skill associated with that language. Having said that, therefore, the point of a variance in language is either to create a bit of mystery or to restrict the use of the item by the players so that there's not a effective min-maxing or character kit bashing or whatever. When you use a linguistics mechanism, you are requiring the players to take an extra time slots to build up their knowledge of how to write things and such. Finally, the lore with which the players need to interact should be presented in the commonly heard language, only because that way you don't get lost in the weeds of trying to translate a specific word or phrase, or to challenge what somebody else has come up as their interpretation of your word or phrase. So the point here, pardon me again. The point here is that languages and linguistics are a way to force into play a change in conversational skill or change in conversational processes in order to make something either more interesting, more unique, or more difficult. And while it is sometimes fun to make your players squirm about the lore of the story, sometimes it's better just to hand wave the language and say, yes, the players have an understanding of it, and then give them the information in English, because quite often the very challenge of the riddle itself is going to be more than enough on its own, and you don't have to make it more difficult by throwing extra languages into the mix. All right. We are going to come to my rant a little bit earlier than I was planning to, but the others were a little bit shorter tonight, and perhaps that's a good thing since I seem to be drifting a bit as far as my train of logic. Player criticism and correction is the rant, and we give ourselves a minute here or so, about another 30 seconds before we roll into it. This is not a reference to the storyteller chastising a player or reminding a player of their place in the game or correcting a misunderstanding between the players. This is actually talking about one player directly interacting with another player in a disparaging fashion. And it comes under both the concept of criticism and correction. And I wouldn't hesitate to say that the players who think they are being corrective are really more than likely just being critical. So that's going to be the first point of this. Alrighty. Here's the rant. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gather around, because a player who makes a mistake in a game does need to be corrected. I've got to say that front and center. If a player is making a mockery of themselves, or they're misinterpreting what's going on in the game, or they're being potentially intentionally obtuse, then they need to be advised. In certain cases, the advice might be repetitive. It might have had to been said time and time again. But the reality is that the criticism of a player from time to time will occur in a role-play game. Either person won't knock it off of an old joke and are just beating the poor thing to death, or they discovered a new rule and are trying to enforce that everybody knows that that rule is in place and that they are the ones that found it. Or, well, you can name a myriad reasons why a player might be wrong. But here's the challenge. It is not helpful when player B, who is not involved in even the scene, player A is working without a net and is on their own, and player B decides to tell player A how they should play their character. This is a big no-no to me. This is as big as possibly any other rant that I've come up to date. If a player has something that is wrong in their activity, it is the game master's task, not the players, to draw them down and specify what is going wrong. It should not be left to the players. And the reason for this is that a player will carry with him the scars of what another player says to them far longer and far deeper than the rant or the conversation that the player would have with the one or two people that have the positioning to make the statement. A player, therefore, needs to be aware of what's going on in the scene and react to it properly, but they shouldn't be watching to see what the other players are doing in terms of the rightness or wrongness of it, because they are not that person. The biggest challenge to role-play games, I think, is that when you're playing a group of personalities, and many of them could be strong at the same time, because that's kind of the element of people who are role-play gamers. They either have really strong alphas and want to do things the way they want, or they are really good betas and want to hear a really good story and engage with the things as would be optimal for them. What we don't need is for a player who has some form of superiority in their mind coming down, even if they're coming down gently, if they're coming down on the other player for the action of their scene, that's a unhelpful and arguably improper positioning for a player. They shouldn't be doing the correction. It's not their job. Having said that, do players have an opportunity or an option to say they don't like what another player's ideas are? Absolutely. It should be almost required for players to have run their ideas past the others in the group to make sure that they can cover your action or they can play into the scene you're trying to do without mucking it up. And so this concept of criticizing is really referring to the adverse kind, where you're actually telling a player, no, you can't play your character that way, or no, you shouldn't take that skill, or whatever. That's not the player's duty, it's the game master's duty to administer and monitor and control the other player's positions. And so the solution to the player criticism rant is that the players should all listen to what the game master has to say, and the game master should immediately challenge those people who make irrational statements or incendiary ones or whatever, and to criticize them directly and correct the situation for everyone involved. It should not have to ever be out there in the air, and it certainly shouldn't be in the mouths of other game players, because they are just as likely to have made mistakes themselves. And so it's not their job to correct. It's the game masters. And game masters aren't really supposed to correct players either, right? I should clarify that. The emphasis I'm trying to make when I say that the GM is correcting them is the GM has to be the arbiter of what is fair, what is correct, and what is accessible in the game. And if a player should come out and say, well, this is the way I see it, and then put pressure on other players to perceive it that way, that's a challenge that the game master would have to handle as well, to keep from that overshadowing the initial complaint. So I can tell you that the number of players I have that do criticize and complain about other players is surprisingly high. And quite often the most critical of players happens to be the strongest and most critical of themselves. And so I can honestly say that, oh, there I go with the honestly again. I think I do it every episode. The methodology I try to use is to be direct when I can be, and kind and generous when I cannot be, because the possibility of a player making a decision to which I oppose is fairly high. But when it comes to actions and deeds, I'm far happier with a player who doesn't have to criticize, but instead gives positive reinforcement and recommendations on how the player can better avoid those problems in the future. So there you have it. My rant is now complete. I'm spent. I'm done with that part of it. So finally, the last few minutes of the show tonight, we're going to talk about the NycosRPG Twitch experiment. And we've talked about the pretty much so I'm blue in the face, but I didn't turn the color, the white balance up high enough for me to be blue in the face. But the NycosRPG Twitch experiment is a 6-hour experiment wherein we play a role-playing game over Twitch directly. In other words, you sign into Twitch, you hop on the channel, and you start to post your comments into the channel, and I treat those as actions called for in the players, and therefore we create a methodology for storytelling that doesn't require you to be on camera or even in studio to be a participant. So It will be on Saturdays, as it has been the last couple of weeks, at 10 o'clock a.m. before everything else gets rolling. I think it's a great place to park a game and say, come and join us. And we will be doing our full session 0 this next week. And when we do that, we'll go over all of the possible player options and such, so that you can get a feel for how the game will run. In the meantime, I want to thank you for spending the time with me today on the Game Master Soapbox. If you like what you're hearing, please follow the channel. If you don't like what you're hearing, thank you for the time you've presented to us so far. I greatly appreciate you being here. And if you are enjoying the content, make sure you follow this on Facebook and like us here on Twitch, and subscribe if you have the inclination, so you'll always know whenever new materials are posted. Also watch for me on the YouTube page, which for me is at NycosRPG, in which case we're going to go ahead and wind this up. Thank you so much again for being here. Thanks to our sponsor as well, and we hope to see you again the next time. Bye.